Have you ever emerged from a conversation, replaying the exchange in your mind, only to be met with a sinking feeling that, despite having all the right answers, you somehow lost ground? That visceral sensation, a tight knot in the throat or a hollow ache in the stomach, is more than just frustration. It is the silent, screaming evidence of power that has been seeded, piece by piece, with every word you felt compelled to offer. We exist in a social ecosystem that glorifies noise, mistaking volume for validity, speed for intelligence, and arrogant posturing for unshakable confidence. We are surrounded by those who dominate dialogues not through superior insight, but through sheer verbal force, interrupting, mocking, and overwhelming with a performance of certainty designed to mask deep-seated insecurity. In this clamorous arena, a pervasive and damaging illusion holds sway, the belief that silence is a void, a vacuum of nothingness that signifies weakness, concession, and defeat. We are conditioned to fear that quiet space, to rush to fill it with explanations, justifications, and rebuttals, terrified that if we do not, we will be seen as complicit, ignorant, or weak. But what if this entire framework is a fallacy? What if the very act of constant engagement is the true trap? Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher perpetually scrutinized yet rarely fully understood, dedicated his work to dismantling this very illusion. He perceived a devastating and counterintuitive truth. Those who speak incessantly are engaged in a process of self-revelation and self-weakening, unknowingly disclosing their insecurities, their needs, and their strategic hand with every unnecessary word. The compulsion to argue, to explain, to win the point, it is not a sign of strength, but a confession of a profound need for external validation, a plea for the herd's approval. Society conditions us to treat every dialogue as a battlefield where truth must be defended with verbal swords. But Nietzsche proposes a more profound, more intelligent, and infinitely more lethal path, the path of strategic silence. This is not merely the absence of sound. It is an active, potent, and overwhelming presence. It is a calculated choice that disconcerts the opponent, destabilizes their expectations, and turns their own energy against them, forcing them to confront the one person they are most desperately trying to escape, themselves, in all their unspoken uncertainty and noise. To truly harness the transformative power of silence, we must first embark on a deep and unflinching examination of the very impulse we seek to master, our compulsive need to speak, to be heard, and to be validated. This is not a superficial habit, but a deeply ingrained psychological architecture, a fortress of the ego that Friedrich Nietzsche diagnosed with terrifying and timeless clarity. He understood that this irresistible urge, this internal pressure to respond, to rebut, to correct, and to relentlessly have the final word, is rarely, if ever, driven by a pure, dispassionate pursuit of truth. Instead, it is almost always a symptom of something far more primal and vulnerable, a fragile ego operating from a foundational place of lack and profound insecurity. This ego, which constructs its entire identity upon the perilously shifting sands of external opinions and social validation, does not perceive a simple disagreement as a mere exchange of ideas. It experiences it as a full-scale personal attack, an existential threat that must be immediately vanquished to preserve its delicate and illusory equilibrium. Every raised eyebrow, every contrary point of view becomes a potential crack in the facade, and so the ego's response is to frantically patch these cracks with more words, more explanations, and more performative certainty.
Nietzsche piercingly observed that most people do not enter debates to learn, to expand their understanding, or to engage in a mutual search for clarity. They enter to conquer, to dominate, and to subjugate. Their goal is to forcefully reaffirm their pre-existing beliefs, not because those beliefs are inherently true, well-examined, or solid, but for the terrifyingly simple reason that their entire sense of self is built upon them. The prospect of those beliefs being genuinely challenged, of being proven wrong or incomplete, is not an intellectual opportunity. It is an existential crisis that threatens to cause their entire world to unravel. Therefore, this common form of argumentation is never truly about the topic being discussed. The subject matter is merely the disposable battlefield. It is, at its core, a form of psychological defensive armor, a desperate and theatrical performance staged not only to convince an opponent, but more importantly, to convince oneself of a stability, intelligence, and righteousness that one fears does not genuinely exist. When you feel that familiar heat rise within your chest, that visceral tightening in your jaw, that urgent need to justify your position, to prove your point, and to make them understand, you must recognize this sensation for what it is, a trap. You have already lost the deeper, more significant game the moment you engage on those terms, because you have revealed your entire strategic hand, and in doing so, shown that you are still playing entirely by the herd's rules. You are still trapped in what Nietzsche famously and scornfully termed the herd morality. This is the invisible, suffocating value system crafted by the weak to ensure collective survival through conformity. It is the morality of those who derive their entire sense of worth from the external expectations of the group, who desperately need to be seen as good, correct, reasonable, and agreeable, and who willingly nullify their own unique perspective, passions, and power to maintain this fragile and ultimately oppressive social harmony. True strength, in the authentic Nietzschean sense, is therefore not about winning this game, but about transcending it entirely. It lies in the radical, solitary, and arduous act of liberating yourself from this desperate need for approval. It is the meticulous cultivation of an unshakable internal compass, so sure, so self-derived, and so resilient that the laughter of the crowd, the sting of criticism, or the cold weight of rejection simply cannot shake its unwavering bearing. It is about consciously forging a self that can stand firm in the storm of being misunderstood, misrepresented, or even reviled, and to remain utterly unshaken, not out of cold arrogance, but out of a deep, quiet, and unassailable integrity that requires no external witness to validate its existence. This profound inner fortitude, this sovereignty of the self, is the true foundation of internal mastery. It is a power that grows not in the barren, noisy skirmishes for social victory, but in the fertile, sacred ground of quiet self-assurance and unwavering self-possession.
Nietzsche's solution to the exhausting and ultimately futile cycle of reactive communication is not found in a simple technique, but in the radical embodiment of an ideal. The Übermensch, or overman, a figure who represents the pinnacle of human potential and a complete transcendence of the petty, validation-seeking dynamics of herd morality. This is not a superior being in a physical sense, but a psychological and spiritual sovereign, an individual who has successfully navigated the arduous journey of self-overcoming to operate from a locus of absolute, unassailable self-control. The Übermensch does not merely participate in the world, he consciously and deliberately shapes it through the sheer force of his will and the unwavering integrity of his presence. Crucially, he often accomplishes this profound influence without uttering a single word, understanding that language, when used carelessly, is a leash that ties you to the understanding and limitations of your audience. His methodology is one of profound observation, a deep and patient listening that transcends waiting for a turn to speak and becomes instead a form of active absorption, a way of mapping the hidden architecture of another's psyche, their fears, their unstated desires, their concealed contradictions. His silence is never empty, passive, or accidental. It is a carefully chosen state,
charged with potent intention and formidable authority. It operates as a unique and disarming form of language, one that completely bypasses the need to convince and instead moves directly to imposing a palpable and often unsettling presence. In a room full of shouting, performative individuals, all vying for attention and dominance through volume, the Übermensch commands a different kind of attention altogether. A deep, resonant respect elicited by a steady gaze, an unhurried posture, and a profound, unbreakable calm. While others anxiously expose their insecurities through a flood of unnecessary explanations and justifications, he reveals their weaknesses merely by reflecting their chaos back at them through the mirror of his own stillness. This powerful silence is, at its core, a strategic economy of energy and information. He understands on a fundamental level that every spoken word is a tactical move revealed to the opponent, and every emotional reaction is an exposed weakness, a crack in the armor that can be exploited. He remains quiet not out of ignorance or because he has nothing of value to say, but precisely because he has nothing he needs to prove to anyone but himself. His very existence, his composed and self-contained presence, becomes its own most eloquent statement of sovereignty. In a decaying society addicted to noise, distraction, and constant external validation, the individual who has mastered the art of silence, who has made it a disciplined practice and a chosen weapon, emerges as the true and only king, reigning not through force of argument, but through the unshakable power of a self that is finally and completely its own.
The devastating effectiveness of strategic silence, the kind wielded by the Übermensch, lies not in what it does, but in what it forces others to do. It operates as a profound psychological mirror, held up with unwavering calm, compelling your opponent to confront the unvarnished reality of their own voice, their own arguments, and the often hollow, anxious resonance these contain when stripped of the comforting noise of external resistance. This is not a passive act, but an intensely active psychological intervention. When you consciously refuse to react, you perform a sudden and brutal act of rhetorical jujitsu, strategically withdrawing the expected energy, the friction of your defense, the fuel of your outrage, that the other person's ego requires to sustain its performance and validate its position. Without your reactive energy to push against, to debate with, or to dominate, they are abruptly left in a void, alone on the stage of their own making, forced to listen to the echo of their words without the comforting buffer of your rebuttal. Modern social psychology provides a robust framework for this phenomenon, confirming that in confrontational settings, extended silence is instinctively and universally perceived not as agreement, but as a form of deep, unspoken judgment. This perception triggers an immediate threat response in the brain, specifically activating the amygdala, the ancient seat of fear, anxiety, and primal alertness. This neural alarm bell throws the speaker into a state of cognitive dissonance and psychological freefall. They are suddenly deprived of the social cues they rely on to navigate the interaction and regulate their own self-image. In this state of uncertainty, the human mind, desperate to regain control and equilibrium, begins to project its own deepest insecurities onto the blank canvas of your silence. A torrent of anxious questions floods their mind. Is he judging me? Does he see right through my argument? Did he notice that subtle contradiction I just made? Does he know I'm bluffing, that I'm not nearly as confident as I sound? In this self-created psychological battlefield, your silence ceases to be an absence and transforms into an invisible, precision blade. It cuts where no one can see, yet the wound is felt deeply, targeting the fragile gap between who they pretend to be and who they fear they truly are. This effect is exponentially magnified when used against manipulators, narcissists, and emotional predators. These individuals do not merely argue points. They traffic in a toxic economy of emotional control, and their entire strategy is predicated on harvesting your reactions, your anger, your frustration, your tears, your flustered explanations. These are the currencies of their power.
the tangible proof that they are getting to you, that they are in control. When you consciously choose to offer them nothing but a placid, observant calm, you fundamentally break their business model. You starve them. Faced with this unexpected famine of emotional supply, they inevitably panic. Their composure cracks, their strategies escalate into desperation, and they often overplay their hand, frantically revealing the very weaknesses, insecurities, and manipulations they had worked so meticulously to conceal. Your silent presence, therefore, becomes the ultimate attack, not on their argument, but on the core illusion of their dominance, destabilizing them by reflecting their own inadequacies and internal chaos back at them with a clarity that is simply unbearable.
Understanding the profound philosophy and psychological mechanics of silence is a vital first step, but it remains a theoretical exercise, an intellectual abstraction, unless it is forged into a practical, unwavering discipline that can be deployed in the heat of the moment. To truly wield silence as the Übermensch does, transforming it from a concept into a precise instrument of immense power, requires a conscious and grueling commitment to self-mastery, beginning with what is perhaps the most difficult internal battle, enduring the piercing scream of your own will as it demands a reaction. This is the foundational moment where power is either claimed or ceded, where you must confront and overcome the deeply conditioned poison of the herd mentality that equates your worth with your visibility in a conflict. That burning desire to justify yourself, to correct the record, to have the final word is not your strength speaking. It is the voice of a fragile ego terrified of being misunderstood or dismissed. And conquering this impulse is the inaugural, essential act of your sovereignty. Once you have held that line within yourself, you must then shift your entire mode of engagement from that of a participant to that of a hunter-observer, a role that demands profound patience and focus. This means listening not with the intent to soon reply, to formulate your counter-argument while the other person is still speaking, but with the intent to deeply understand the hidden emotional and psychological terrain of your interlocutor. You must become a connoisseur of subtext, attuned to the subtle tremors of fear hidden between the lines, the barely perceptible contradictions in their logic, the brittle arrogance that masks a core of insecurity, and the unconscious tells that reveal their true motivations. You absorb this intelligence not as a passive receptacle, but as a strategist gathering critical data, storing it away, knowing that if and when you finally choose to break your silence and speak, your words will be surgical, devastatingly accurate, and capable of dismantling their position with minimal effort, because they will strike at the vulnerabilities they themselves revealed. Furthermore, you must learn to master the weapon of time itself, understanding that the pause, the prolonged silence, is a crucible where unbearable tension is forged. Most people operate on a rhythm of immediate stimulus and response, and when you disrupt this rhythm by allowing a silence to linger, stretch, and deepen, you create a vacuum of discomfort that the other person will feel compelled to fill, often with rambling excuses, hasty concessions, or self-incriminating additions that they would never have offered under normal conversational pressure. A simple, calm, and steady gaze, held for a few seconds longer than is socially comfortable, can wield more authoritative power than 1,000 shouted words, as it demonstrates a control over the tempo and the emotional atmosphere that is the mark of true dominance. Finally, through the consistent application of these practices, you will cultivate an aura of radical unpredictability, which in itself becomes a formidable asset. The master of silence is inherently ambiguous and therefore impossible to map, strategize against, or manipulate. When people cannot anticipate your reactions, when your responses cannot be neatly categorized, they are forced into a state of heightened caution and respect. You cease to be a reactive participant dancing to their tune, and instead become the gravitational center, the fixed point around which the entire interaction helplessly orbits, allowing you to define the terms, control the flow, and end conflicts on your own terms long before they ever escalate into open verbal warfare.
In this journey toward mastering silence, we arrive at the most critical and often misunderstood crossroads, a distinction so vital that misinterpreting it can transform a potential weapon into a chain of your own making. The chasm between the silence of sovereignty and the silence of submission. It is absolutely imperative to understand that the potent strategic silence championed by Nietzsche is not and must never be confused with the numb, resigned quiet of the defeated, the suppressed or the oppressed. This latter silence is not strength, it is a domesticated and weary surrender. The silent internal scream of someone who has resigned themselves to being used, manipulated, and emotionally drained because they believe their voice is powerless or that conflict is an evil to be avoided at all costs. This desire for peace is in reality a costly illusion, a fragile truce purchased with the devaluation of your own self-respect, where you willingly become a spectator in your own life. In this state, your calm is systematically mistaken for consent. Your patience is exploited as permission, and your listening ear is used as a stepping stool for others to elevate themselves upon. This is the corrosive reality of what Nietzsche scornfully termed the slave morality, an invisible value system that prizes harmony and appeasement over authenticity and power, teaching you to nullify your own desires, diminish your own light, and conform to external expectations, all while mistakenly believing this self-betrayal is a virtue. True, powerful silence, in the Nietzschean sense, is its polar opposite. It is active, potent, deliberate, and charged with unspoken will. It is not about avoiding conflict out of fear, but about transcending the need for it altogether through such an undeniable presence that conflict becomes unnecessary. It is the quiet that exists not because you were afraid to speak, but because you have consciously chosen not to, and that choice itself radiates authority. To wield this weapon correctly, you must therefore perform a ruthless internal audit. You must put to death the silence of the slave within you, the part that swallows insults, buries resentment, and shrinks to fit, and consciously midwife the birth of the silence of the sovereign. This new silence does not bend, does not apologize for its own existence, and does not seek permission to occupy space. It stands, immutable and unassailable, as a continuous and unwavering affirmation of your being. A boundary set not with words, but with sheer, palpable presence. It is the difference between being silent because you are afraid of the consequences of speaking, and being silent because the other person has not yet earned the privilege of your truth.